Hello, everyone. My name is Phil Rogoski, and welcome to the workshop on centering prayer. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Mark Dannenfelser. Mark is the program coordinator for Contemplative Outreach. That's the organization founded by Travis monk Thomas Keating. Contemplative Outreach is a spiritual network of individuals and small faith communities committed to living the contemplative dimension of the gospel. The common desire for design transformation, primarily expressed through a commitment to a daily centering prayer practice, unites our international interdenominational community. Mark is a certified mindfulness teacher, a licensed professional counselor, a certified spiritual director, a registered yoga teacher, and a commissioned presenter of the Centering Prayer Method. Professionally, Mark is most interested in working at the point of intersection between contemplative practice and healing. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate the introduction, and I also appreciate you holding space for us here today. In case I don't get a chance later, I also want to thank the tech team. Caitlin and Adam are working magic behind the scenes here. Also appreciative for the Center for Action and Contemplation for the invitation to be here with all of you today. We're so grateful for the partnership between the CAC and Contemplative Outreach. Founders of both those organisms, Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating, had a long and wonderful friendship and a common mission. And I'm delighted to be here sharing the fruits of their work. I'd like to start with a quote from Thomas Merton. This is a journal in his entry, the Asian Journal of Thomas Merton. And he entered this the day before he died in 1968. He recorded this in his journal. He said, "The deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless. It is beyond words. It is beyond speech. It is beyond concept." He goes on, "It's not that we discover a new unity. We discover an older unity. My dear brothers and sisters, we are already one, but we imagine that we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity." With that, if we could put up a couple of slides here, as I just want to say a few things. Let me see. There you go. I want to speak for just a little bit about contemplation, and then I'd like to talk about the method that helps assist the development of contemplation called centering prayer. And then we'll have some time to pray together, and we'll also have time for a conversation. When we talk about prayer, all prayer, we may best understand it as first and foremost a relationship. Ultimately, prayer is a love relationship with God and a love relationship with all things that God created and inhabits. We may often think of prayer as thoughts or feelings expressed in words. And, our word prayers are very important for many of us. But these are not the only expressions of prayer. There's much more to prayer and a prayer life than thoughts, words, images, beliefs, and feelings, as Merton is suggesting in his entry in his journal. The prayer of the heart goes beyond words towards silent communion. This wordless prayer is called contemplation, and it's an invitation to simply be in the presence of God, which we already are, and to recognize that oneness that Merton spoke about, that oneness with God, the God of love. Rather than an active consideration of concept or reflection on a scene or an analysis of our relationship with God, contemplation instead comes from the perspective, or at least from the perspective of the Christian tradition, is a reduction of activity to simply be without any expectations of how it should be. We could come back to the slides. Oh, great, thanks. And while contemplation has been around for thousands of years, emerging from the Judeo-Christian tradition, centering prayer is a modern method, and it's designed to facilitate contemplation. A lot of you know this, the history of contemplation, so I won't go on about it, but it's just helpful to remind us that we see contemplation in the Jewish text, in the Hebrew scriptures, as early as seeing Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. And we see it showing up in the Christian scriptures, in the teaching of Jesus. And on the idea of communion with God and prayer, the early church takes its instruction from St. Paul, who urges all Christians to pray without ceasing. We then see the practice of contemplation being developed in the early Christian communities of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, followed by the establishment of monasteries, driven in large part by Saint Benedict, at least in the West. And in the 6th century, Gregory the Great summarized the great Christian contemplative tradition as simply resting in God. We also see the advancement of the contemplative tradition on up into the 16th century in the writings of mystics such as Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And then in the modern era, Thomas Merton wrote books from his monastic cell that described the practice of contemplation to not just monks, but to lay people alike. His writings were cut short by his untimely death in 1968. And this is where Thomas Keating emerged to carry on the work of opening up the Christian contemplative tradition to all people. Keating wanted to develop a simple method that could help people enter into contemplative practice and the contemplative life. So Keating, along with fellow monks William Menninger and Basil Pennington, looked back into the tradition and discovered in the 14th century book, The Cloud of Unknowing, a simple description of prayer using a 1 or 2 syllable word to help establish a receptive mode of simply consenting to God's will and action in one's life. That ancient method was reimagined using modern language and simple guidelines for practicing, and Keating became a key transmitter of the prayer, speaking and writing, and eventually establishing the global community of Contemplative Outreach International. So what is the method of centering prayer? In his writings, Keating reminds us that centering prayer is an exercise of attention and intention. We intend to go to our innermost being, and we move towards that intention when we attend to letting go of thoughts which can tend to limit a limitless God. So you could say centering prayer is a prayer of receptivity. And the only real activity on the part of the one who is praying is to let go by consenting to God's action within. And we work on letting go of anything and everything that obstructs our ability to recognize and live from our total union with the God of love. And while this prayer emerges from the Judeo-Christian lineage, it is a universal prayer, accessible to all, because it does not require a particular view of God. It simply invites us to consent to love as the primary disposition in life. And anything that obstructs our desire to love all is left behind. So now I would like to briefly teach you the method of centering prayer. And if you already know how to practice centering prayer, it's still worth reflecting again on these basic guidelines of the method. We can go back to the slide. I'll put the guidelines up there. There they are. We have 4 guidelines to describe the prayer. First, we choose a sacred symbol. It's often referred to as a sacred word, but really it can be other things like the breath or a simple image. And after selecting a sacred symbol, we then gently introduce the symbol as we sit quietly. And any time that we notice our mind drifting off, becoming engaged in thought, being pulled away by certain emotion or a commentary, then we just simply return to the symbol any and every time as best we can. And we do that for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And at the end of that time, whatever time we've decided to sit for, we remain in silence for another minute or 2, following that centering prayer period itself. And we believe that this helps us to integrate the prayer into our everyday experience, transitions us from sitting on the cushion to living our life. I just want to say a couple more things about the sacred symbol. So as I said, it's often suggested that it be a sacred word, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anything that allows you to return to consenting to God and letting go of thoughts and images and emotions. The sacred symbol represents our willingness to reaffirm our intention to consent to God's presence and action within us and within our lives. And this act of consent over and over again develops in us a receptivity and an openness to God acting in our life. In centering prayer, the word thoughts is an umbrella term for any kind of perception at all, including body sensations, images, emotions, memories, reflections, concepts, commentaries, what we perceive as spiritual experiences, anything. In short, thoughts mean any and all perceptions. And whether our thoughts are of the everyday nature, such as I've got to go pick up the dry cleaning, or more spiritual matters, such as I think I'm seeing God right now. It doesn't matter in centering prayer. A thought is a thought is a thought. And in the practice, we treat them all the same. Not one is good or bad, not one is interesting or boring, spiritual or ordinary. Whatever the thought that emerges during our prayer practice, we simply return to the sacred symbol. And we do so gently, without fussing and without worrying about what it is that's popping up. This is a sort of a handy reminder, what we call the 4 R's regarding thoughts, that we resist no thought, we retain no thought, even if we think they're really important and you've had some insight directly from God, we don't retain it during the time of prayer. And we react emotionally to no thought. And there's no need to react to whatever is coming down the stream of consciousness during the prayer. And the 4th R is to, when a thought comes, which it will, in the form of an emotion or sensation, it's natural, it's even necessary. Then when it does, though, we just practice returning ever so gently to the sacred word or the sacred symbol. And each return to the sacred symbol, every time you become engaged in a thought, is a prayer and an act of love. As Keating says, the sacred symbol is a way of renewing your intention to open yourself up to God. And for those of us who worry about having a lot of thoughts during the prayer time, Keating says, 1,000 thoughts, great. 1,000 opportunities to return to God. So I'd like to do a short practice of centering prayer with all of you. We'll take just around 10 minutes or so to sit together in silence and to pray this prayer. And we'll begin with choosing a sacred symbol. You may already have this as part of your practice, and so you can just go to what you normally do, a word or the breath. But if not, you can just now decide, and you don't have to kind of sweat over it or make it a big decision. We don't change whatever we pick during the period of centering prayer, because that would be a form of thinking like, oh, this word isn't working, I should change it. But just pick, if it's a word, a simple 1 or 2 syllable word: love, God, peace, calm, union, amen. If if English isn't your first language, you can choose a word in your own native language. Or some people just like to have an awareness of the breath. And when they're distracted by a thought or an emotion, they simply come back to breathing in and breathing out. And remember, we're not trying to stop thoughts from coming. We're just not engaging with them, kind of going downstream with them. So we'll be silent for about 10 minutes or so, simply practicing letting go of thoughts and returning to this consenting to God. And at the end of the silent prayer period, I'll ring a bell just to let us know it's ending. And then we'll have an opportunity for a couple of comments and reflections from any of you. So let me ring the bell now, and just allow the bell to kind of ring off and invite us into the interior as it slowly rings off into silence. Maybe just allowing for a gentle transition, maybe taking a breath or two, a deeper breath or two. And if your eyes were closed, just gently opening the eyes and reconnect with the screen. And we're just going to take a pause here for a few comments or questions or reflections about the practice or about anything I've said thus far. And then I have a couple more comments after that. But first, I'd love to hear from you. And maybe if we can unmute, Phil's unmuted. So he's going to help us out. If you want to post something in the chat box, question or comment, or if you'd like to ask it yourself out loud, just simply raise your virtual hand and we'll call your name out and we'll get you up on the screen. You can ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you, Mark. And for those of you, I should also say, just as a reminder, this session is being recorded because we want to have Mark's lovely teaching. And as you ask questions, you will be highlighted on the screen. So just know that that's coming and we would love to hear from you. If you don't know how to raise your virtual hand, click the reactions button in the lower right of your Zoom screen and you'll see a button in there that says raise hand. And then we'll call on you in the order that you raise your hands. Here we go. We've got a couple. Sorry. How does centering prayer differ from mindfulness meditation, Mark?
That's a great question, which I tend to hear a lot because I'm in the fields of both contemplative prayer and mindfulness meditation. Centering prayer is a prayer, and it comes from the Christian tradition. As I said earlier, it's accessible to all because it doesn't require a belief system, but it is a prayer that we are in the process of praying. We continue to turn ourselves over to a God as we understand, and that can differ for a lot of us. It's also a prayer of receptivity. People talk about mindfulness a little bit differently, and it depends what expression of mindfulness that you're involved in. My training is with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, and that's a particular kind of expression of it in the West, taken mostly from the Buddhist tradition. So it's an awareness practice, mindfulness is. But I also think it is a prayer of receptivity, or it's a practice of receptivity, because we are letting go in a similar way. We're letting go of thoughts and emotions and whatever tends to show up in the time that we're sitting. But the clear distinction is in centering prayer, we are praying to a God of our own understanding, or God of love, God who we are consenting and turning our lives over to. I hope that helps. It's probably a much longer conversation that we could have about that.
Thank you, Mark. Because a couple of people
had
that. Yeah, a couple of people had that question in the chat, so thank you for that. And then Christy Jernigan asked, is part of the practice to acknowledge intention at the beginning?
Yes, I think that's what, for us, we use the sacred symbol to kind of be that placeholder of that intention. But certainly when we start, and that's the idea of like coming to your, if it's a word or the breath, to begin. And that is a way of setting your intention. And the intention, as we describe it in centering prayer, is to consent to God's will and to God's action in our life. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thank you for that. And Rita Shabel asked, do you keep repeating the symbol to keep other thoughts out?
Yes, great question, Rita. And again, there's a lot of different contemplative practices. There's a lot of different meditations. And in centering prayer, we don't use it in that repetitive way like a mantra. It's simply a placeholder when we see that we're engaged in thought or pulled away by some emotion or thinking about some concept. once we become aware of that, we use the word or the breath or whatever the symbol is to simply bring us back to the present moment, which is the presence moment, and to simply sitting in that presence with a kind of receptive openness. So we're not trying to keep thoughts out. That's really not possible to do. Our minds are constantly working. So it's no failure on your part or on the part of the prayer if thoughts are coming, and a lot of them are coming. It's just we simply come back each and every time to the sacred symbol. That's why I love that quote by Keating when he says, it's fine if you have 1,000 thoughts, because you have 1,000 opportunities to reaffirm your consent to God.
Thank you, Mark. And just we'll probably just take one more question now and then hold the others for the end to make sure that we get in the rest of the presentation. And,
Sure.
And for now, Rick, I would probably butcher your last name if I attempted it, but Rick, we'll call on you now.
What's the difference between centering prayer and contemplative practice? And if you do a, sit in the Buddhist style of meditation, is that form of meditation more contemplative? If you went to a contemplative retreat, would that be the way it would be organized, around having a regimented schedule of so many sits a day and learning how to quiet your mind and get into the state?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I appreciate you bringing up both those words in the same sentence, contemplative practice and meditative practices, because, there are a lot of them, and depending on who you're talking to and what country they're in and what period of time they're in, you'll hear meditation and contemplation kind of used interchangeably or in different ways. So from the perspective of centering prayer, we think of meditation as a more kind of reflective practice, maybe considering an icon and reflecting on what that means to you and kind of entering into prayer in that way, or reflecting on a concept. So that's mostly in the West, but certainly in centering prayer circles, it's thought of meditation in that way. We're meditating on something, so it's a little more active. And in centering prayer, we think of contemplation as that more wordless, imageless, basically just sitting in the presence and consenting to God. So it's a good distinction to make, because it can be confusing depending on who you're talking to or who you're reading. But the other part of your question about what could you expect is it's similar when, say, you go on a centering prayer retreat, as it might be for a Zen Buddhist retreat or some other kind of meditation retreat. And yes, there are some similarities. In centering prayer retreats, you sit for periods of time, usually 20 to 30 minutes at a time. If you're there for, say, a weekend or 5 days, you might do that a few hours a day. And in between, there may be walking meditation. Sometimes there's a bit of a teaching that you reflect on. Most of the time, those are completely silent retreats. So that's similar to, it sounds like what you might be referring to, Rick, in terms of being involved in other meditative practices, say Buddhist. Is that? Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you all for your comments and questions. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk for a little bit more, and then we'll have another short practice centering prayer, and then we'll have some more time for conversation. Thanks, Phil, for working that discussion for us. Let me go back to the slides, if you don't mind. Yeah, so I want to talk, we titled this workshop Centering Prayer and Our Basic Core of Goodness. What do we mean by that? So I want to say just a few words about our basic core of goodness. In Keating's book, Open Mind, Open Heart, which is kind of the centering prayer, I don't want to say Bible, but it really describes centering prayer in great detail. But in that book, Keating says, what then is our principal focus in centering prayer? What are we doing? And he says, it is to deepen our relationship with Jesus Christ, the divine human being. So if it is, the whole prayer is about deepening our relationship, entering into this union with Christ, which already exists, then why is it for many of us, I know for me at times, that we experience a kind of separation, a kind of lack of union? What separates us from a loving relationship with God and by extension to all other people? The Sufi mystical poet Rumi said, "Your task is not to seek for love." No, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Keating is very interested in those barriers. He's interested in that human condition that we all have, that where we put up walls, where we maybe don't, fully fall into this relationship of love. And Keating says it's our culturally conditioned attitudes and our psychological feelings, such as guilt or fear, that can be and usually are obstacles to deepening not just our relationship with God, but any relationship. So it's the fundamental goodness of human nature that is essential. It's an essential element of the Christian faith. This is the most, in my mind, basic understanding of Christianity. It's kind of Jesus 101, that we must come to understand and embrace this one basic truth, that you are good down to your core. It is your nature. It is the way that you were created. And your goodness comes from a God who is by her nature good. All of us, or everyone, even the people you don't like, were created in that image. And you can resist this truth. You can ignore this truth. You can forget about it at times. And you can live as though it were not true. And you can even do terrible things or have experienced terrible things done to you. But it will still be true. God can only act out of love. And we too are part of that love, created by God. And everything that comes from love is good, even if we don't always live out our inherent goodness. Because you are good at your core, and because God is good at God's core, and because this is a basic truth, it can never be untrue. Because of this goodness, God loves everyone just the same. And with God, there are no exceptions to this truth. In contemporary terms, we read from open mind, open heart. The acceptance of our basic goodness is a quantum leap in the spiritual journey. The acceptance of our basic core of goodness, and I would add, and the goodness of everyone else, is a quantum leap in the spiritual journey. Keating goes on, this basic core of goodness is capable of unlimited development, indeed of becoming transformed in Christ. In the Hebrew scripture, we're told that we are created in the image and likeness of God. In the book of Genesis, one of the creation myths declares, God declares creation of humanity to be very good. And this theme of goodness continues in the Christian scripture, where we hear in the first letter to Timothy, everything God created is good. In our own contemplative outreach community, we have a vision that includes several principles that guide the vision. And this idea that everything is created out of the goodness of God is reflected in our principle number 5, which states, the divine indwelling communicates with us in 2 ways. First, it reminds us of our creation out of nothing in the image and likeness of God. This belief affirms our basic core of goodness that flows from the gift of life itself. Second, it heals the wounds of our human nature, springing from primitive stages of consciousness. Our instinctual needs have not yet been fully integrated into our evolving state of consciousness, and with its capacity for abstract thinking, free choice, and compassion for others. The principle concludes, spiritual evolution is the healing process of divine transformation through the intimacy established in prayer and in following the example and teaching of Jesus in our daily life. It would be easy to dismiss the essential goodness in me and in you and in those places and people where hate seems to reign. And yet the principle does not discount anyone. It acknowledges, though, that because of our wounds and our traumas, yes, we can act from a place of not so goodness. And so we need the transforming action of the Spirit of love to be healed in order to recover our original goodness and to live from that truth. And when we affirm the goodness in all, we are then able to treat each other, everyone, with love. And our activism, our action in the world will be driven by this truth and will come from a completely different place. In his book, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela says, no one is born hating another person because of color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, then they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. It's a bit of a drag, especially as a Christian, but the insistence of this principle that the core of goodness is in all, it compels us to love all. And as we know from the Christian text, especially our enemies. During centering prayer, each time we return to our sacred symbol, we open up and allow the Spirit to affirm our basic core of goodness and gradually reducing down the unconscious obstacles to a deeper relationship with God and with all. So I'd like to take just a few more minutes now for another sitting practice. And I'll ring the bell again to bring us into it, and then I'll ring it again to bring us out of it. And this time, just try to settle in and let go. So choose a sacred symbol, maybe the one you used before. No need to switch it up or do anything different. And whether that be a word, the breath, and sit comfortably enough so that you can just be in relative stillness. Anyway, we always have twitches and things, but even those sensations, we can let those go by and simply remain sitting. And if you're comfortable, you can close the eyes. You don't need to close your eyes. You can just kind of soften your gaze or maybe look away from the screen and just have a kind of ease of sitting. So ring the bell now and invite us into the depth of silence, the inner core of our being, the place of the presence. Again, just transitioning gently from this time of stillness, sitting. I want to end with an excerpt from Howard Thurman's book, Meditations of the Heart, and then we'll have a chance for some conversation. In the book, Meditations of the Heart, Thurman says, "How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see one's self pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. As we listen floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down." So if we could get Phil unmuted again, we'll in the same way we did before, take a couple comments or questions. I know there's been some things in the chat box, particularly resources. We'll put up a slide at the very end with some resources, books and otherwise. But I mentioned open mind, open heart before. This is a good place to start with Keating. And you can find that on Contemplative Outreach, the website there. There's also links to our YouTube page where there are a lot of good videos of Keating talking about centering prayer. There are a lot of other writers on this, Richard being one of them, who writes brilliantly on contemplation and even talks specifically about centering prayer. And there are a lot of other folks, the other founders that I mentioned, Basil Pennington and William Menninger. But that's easy enough to find. So let's go to some questions. Why don't we, Phil, what do you got?
Mark, while you're talking about resources, could you briefly mention where the Contemplative Outreach app is? Because that came up a couple times in the chat.
Oh, yes. It's actually, let's put that slide up for a second, if we don't mind. There it is. So that's our website, which has links to all of this. And then the Centering Prayer mobile app is simply called Centering Prayer. And it's got that logo I was putting up, that multicolored logo, the green and blue and orange and red. So it'll jump out at you if you go on whatever device you're using and go to the App Store.
Thank you very much for that. Like I said, that was a common question in the chat. And to pull just a couple questions from the chat, and I do want to get to everybody who has a hand up. So one of the questions that came up in the chat was, how important is it to develop a daily practice of centering prayer, and what are the fruits of centering prayer? Yeah,
it's a great question. The recommendation is that you make this a daily practice. And if we're working on the shortcomings in our own life and moving towards transformation, learning any new thing comes from repetition. It's how we learn everything, including tying our shoes. And then eventually it becomes part of us and part of our life, and we no longer have to sit there and figure out how to tie our shoes. It just happens for us. But that all comes from repetition. So the repetition that's recommended in centering prayer circles is to have a daily practice, and really a twice daily practice. There's not a magic number for that in terms of how many times, and also in terms of length of time, but throughout the tradition you see often 20 to 30 minutes of sitting twice a day. Keating was fond of saying once a day is for maintenance, twice a day is for transformation. So pick what it is you want, if, and I have found that in my own life as I deepen the time. It's not all about time, but it's because it's about intention too. But and of course, if you can't do that right now in your life, that's fine. Just do whatever you can. Do 5 minutes whenever you can steal away some time in the morning or in the evening. Was there another part to that question? Sorry.
No,
Okay.
that was it. And thank you very much. And so we've got 4 people with hands up. We'll try to get to them because we have just a couple minutes. So please keep your questions real short. If you wouldn't mind, Patty Franson will call on you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask on that orientation of receptivity, but also not retaining any thoughts. Over time, as receptivity develops, things do come in that may be ideas or insights, or symbols that we might understand later. What do you recommend, or what are some practices for capturing some of that after the sitting?
Yeah, exactly. You answered it, Patty. Capture it after the sitting. If it's something that really maybe has a message for you or something, it's more likely to just be there later too. It's very tempting for me, I know, especially if I think, oh man, I've got this great insight right now as I'm sitting here. I want to go off. Sometimes I'll even keep something, nearby just in case. But that really shifts from what we're doing. It's fundamentally different than what we're doing in the practice, because the practice says it doesn't matter what it is. Let it all go downstream. And rather than diving in after it or leaning down there or even going upstream and creating a dam to kind of keep things from coming, because that's the other side of that, not wanting certain things. Just says, no, practice, because that's the strength of consent, is to let it all go by without us kind of orchestrating it. So, but it is tricky at times. And, but I have also found that later on, maybe it wasn't the exact wording that came to me in the prayer, but I'm able to kind of capture what that is. Yeah, but it would be outside the formal prayer practice. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Mark. And next we'll call on Sandy.
Thank you. Actually, that was really helpful, because that second part of my question was what you just said. But one of the things that came up in my thoughts that I shouldn't be holding on to during my centering prayer was, you spoke earlier about, this idea of the basic goodness. And I think what struck me is, wait, all I hear in church is we're sinners, but then I started, as we were sitting, I started thinking this is like Richard spoke of the shadow. We're both. We've got both in us. We're not black or white. We're that shadow, that gray with both darkness and light. But I got all excited about it. But I did let it, you fortunately ended it about then, so I had to let it go. So that was good.
Saved by the bell, Sandy. Saved by the bell. But no, you're right. We do hear that a lot in many of our churches, that we are in sin. And we do. We know when we're not living to that full potential, when we're not behaving that way. And I don't mean to minimize that in any way. There are really some horrific things that happen because of the human condition, the part of us that is not always living in that state, in that awareness. But that's why I think it's so important to talk about that basic core of goodness, which does not change. It's not like God keeps changing her mind about this, and making you good and then making you bad and then making you good. It's just that we're not living out of that at times. That's clear. And in centering prayer terms, we talk about the need for divine therapy to kind of rid. That's why I like that Rumi quote. Because I have barriers to that. Many of us do, very real and difficult barriers to overcome. Traumas in our life, abuse that's been done where we're not that great with loving freely. But the prayer is meant to work with that and break that down so that we're receptive to a loving response. I know we're watching the time, Phil.
Yes, Mark, I was just going to say, just because we do have a time boundary, I wanted to say thank you all so much for showing up And thank you, Mark, for this excellent, excellent presentation and teaching. Thank you for the great questions, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin and Adam, for your support. And I believe we may be sticking around for a while afterwards, but if you have to go, please feel free to go. And thank you again for being here.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay around. And thank you, Phil. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being here and appreciate all of you being here. Thank you. But yeah, we can continue if you have questions or you want to chat amongst yourselves. The chat box will remain open, and we'll be here.
Why don't we take another question? Christy, I think it's Jernigan. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with the kerning on the last name, but I think it's Jernigan.
Yeah, it's Jernigan. Very good.
Hi, Christy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the acknowledgement of, what goes in the heart, what goes on in the heart during this, because if you're sitting in the presence of God, then there's very much that opening to love that for me was happening in the last session. So, I mean, I'd like to acknowledging that and not, going away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is, and that's, I think, sometimes the challenge of the prayer is there's a kind of a vulnerability if we let go of my own sort of control of things or my own making things work a certain way or not. Not that we shouldn't do that in areas of our life and take responsibility for things. But when we simply rest in the awareness of this basic core of goodness and in that love, that sort of takes us out of the equation, especially if that's, as we understand it, God's initiation. We God initiates that love. We didn't make that up, we're just soaking in it. And that's throughout the tradition. But as we said earlier, that's gotten lost in the tradition, and it's become really, as Richard likes to say, this thing about merits, and you got to keep proving it all the time that God is going to love me, and that's why I think, what I said in one of those last slides with the image of the child there, which happened to be my child many years ago, but that when we act in the world, whether that's activism, and formally being involved in something, or whether we're just acting in our kind of daily lives, it's good to be in touch with that. There it is, Josh. It's good to be in touch with that, that it's coming from a place of love. Because I can do some nice things for people too, but not have love in my heart for it. And that matters. Yeah.
Thank you for
I
that,
give you
Sandy.
another.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
I'll give you another quote just because I had it here as a just in case from Thomas Merton. But I just love this about the primacy of love motivating all of this and motivating us. And he says in his book, The Wisdom of the Desert Sayings of the Desert Fathers, he says that all through the Verbis Signorum, which is the Latin word for the elders, all through the writings of the elders, the desert fathers and the desert mothers, he says we find a repeated insistence on the primacy of love over everything else in the spiritual life, over knowledge, over gnosis, asceticism, contemplation, solitude, prayer, over all of that. Love, in fact, is the spiritual life. And without it, all the other exercises of the spirit, however lofty, are emptied of content and become mere illusions. The more lofty they are, the more dangerous the illusion. That's Merton, and he's saying if you don't have love, you don't have anything. You can be a nice person, but that's different.
Great quote, Mark. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Sandy. Then next we have Deborah.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit about those barriers that we have? I know what my barriers are, and in the midst of being in those with those things that are barriers to me for love, could you just speak to that a little bit in regards to centering prayer? Do you take that in as an intention to maybe clear those barriers?
Yeah, I don't think you have to kind of, the intention is a more of a general thing. The intention is to consent to God, God's will and God's action in our life in a broad way. So I think we do need to kind of deal with whatever our barriers are and become more aware of them and, kind of work with them and all. But in the practice itself, it's just turning it all over, whether it's conscious in us, like my self-interest or my control. And Keating does talk about this a lot because it's an important part. It's what he considers to be happening in transformation, that my inordinate desires and attachments, come from the human condition. And they're kind of unresolved things like my need for security. Okay, we all have that, but it goes off the charts if maybe you didn't feel very secure a lot in your life, or control, or esteem. And so, Keating says that all gets taken care of in the practice, that as we continue to consent, we're kind of going around, it's not just a circle, it's more of a spiral because we're coming towards the center as we do it. But something will pop up. I just start to let go of my need to get it to be right all the time, or to control every situation, or to feel completely secure, And so that's how it kind of gets worked on in a sense. But I think it's good in other places, just like we said before about like recording insights at another time. It's good to go to spiritual direction or therapy, or to be in a community that supports you, or to, read books that help you to work on that and be aware of that and all. I hope that helps, Deborah. Is that? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Thanks very much. And then next we have Paul Rossetti.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. Thank you very much for being available today and for taking these questions.
My pleasure.
I've been aware of and practicing now for a couple of years. I'm somewhat limited because there's no community where I live. The closest one's about 5 hours away. But with the pandemic comes Zoom, and I've been able to connect, so that's been great. My question is, I'm interested in bringing this into my postgraduate work. I'm a principal of a small elementary school, and I'd like to be working with youth on this. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of support from contemplative outreach that I can connect with, or if there's something that I can connect to so that I can bring this practice to youth and children, so that we can maybe get a head start on some of those blocks before they manifest.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, for that. On the first point about, being somewhat isolated in terms of centering prayer communities or other communities of practice, I know we're not the only ones. There are many places doing this now, but centering prayer has a lot of online communities. They were there already, but they certainly expanded during the pandemic. And on the website, we have links to, you can find our meditation chapels, which are online prayer communities. And some of them are set up even topically, like we have 12-step recovery centering prayer groups, things like that. So that's a good place, because we just finished our international conference last weekend, and we got comments about that too, how people were grateful for being able to connect. Some people, who are in remote areas, you're not going to go down to your local church and find a centering prayer group, maybe one day. But on the second question about youth, we have a lot of service teams as part of contemplative outreach. And these are teams that, go into particular areas. We have a prison outreach team, and we have a group now that's doing a lot more working with youth. There's a good book, the name is escaping me now, but you can find it on the website. I feel like I keep doing a commercial for the website, but I'm starting to sound like a used car salesman. But there's a book there that's specifically teaching centering prayer to children, which is it's a really great book. So you could check that out. You could find that on other online book services as well. Thanks, Paul, for that question.
And Mark, if it's okay, I'll go back to some of the questions that came up during the chat, because I think some of them were pretty good.
Sure, that's great.
One of them is, and why is it called centering prayer when we are not praying?
Well, we are praying in terms of, consenting to God as a prayer specifically. But I guess more technically, I'll answer the question more technically. How did it come to be called centering prayer? When those three monks, Thomas Keating, William Menninger, and Basil Pennington, who were all in the same monastery at the time, and this was right after Vatican II, the Pope called all abbots from the Christian monasteries, the Catholic monasteries, I guess, and said, guys, we've got to, put our hands back on the contemplative tradition. It's getting lost. And Merton had died in 68, and he was really doing a lot to advance that. So he kind of charged the abbots to go back to their monasteries and figure out ways to communicate the contemplative tradition. So when they went to, I think I might have skipped through this in the presentation, but when those three monks went back to their home monastery, St. Joseph's in Spencer, Massachusetts, one of them, Menninger, found The Cloud of Unknowing, the book, The Cloud of Unknowing, 14th century anonymous book on contemplation, in the monastery bookstore. Nobody knew it was there. It was all dusty. And he dusted it off and he looked through it, and he found, a basic method to teach centering prayer and to practice centering prayer. So originally it was called the Prayer of the Cloud. But then they found in Merton's writings, and I think it came up at one of the retreats that somebody mentioned, that Merton talked about praying in a way that centers us, and that we center down, as Howard Thurman was saying in that quote. And so then it became centering prayer. But it is prayer. And I think, what I said before about the distinction between other kinds of meditation that might be more, just attention practices or secular kinds of meditation. This is a prayer. It's just an accessible prayer, because it doesn't really require you to believe in it or to see God in a certain way in order to gain admission to that prayer. Thank you for that question and those distinctions.
Thank you, Mark. And we've got another hand raised, and that's Emily. So we'll call on her.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. So I've been meditating for quite a bit, 10 years or so. And what I found that helped me the most was it really helped me detach from all of the, Richard Rohr said, all of the roles that I thought that I was, And so I find whenever I meditate that I started to develop, and it took a long time, but developed in myself where all of my thoughts are kind of like clouds, right? And so I'm no longer identifying with my anger, my fear, or this thought that came up. And I realized, not all the time, sometimes I realize that I'm like that background of the sky, that utter expanse. And that is the place where I find that I enter this inner knowing and almost descend deeper into that interior castle, right? Which is the union of you and God together. So I don't know, that's just what came up to me while I was watching your presentation, of that it's not every moment, it's not every time that I have that feeling, but sometimes when I sit and I finally am able to allow and detach and say, oh, these are just my thoughts. This is not me anymore. And then I enter deep into that place of quiet and unknowing. And that's when I enter that place, and I feel like, isn't that where we're trying to, is that the point, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is that the point that we're trying to enter, is that allowing, that that radical acceptance of everything that is. And then that is the space of quiet that you enter. And that's when you find God in the silence. And then you realize that you're really aligned with that. And you kind of didn't know this your whole life before. I don't know. I don't know if that's a question or a statement. I don't know. That's
No,
just what came up.
it's a beautiful comment, you know, and on the practice and on your experience in the practice, you know, and I think detachment is a useful word, you know, to consider what's really going on. So it's not about stopping thoughts and stopping ideas and emotions. It's about not kind of grabbing onto them or biting down on the hook of them, you know, and then being carried away by them. And so detaching is part of that. So things can come through. It's not like, oh no, that shouldn't happen by now after 10 years. No, it does. It's just your ability to sort of hold loosely or not quite at all. Like we would if we saw a cloud in the sky and, you know, it was very interesting to us, but we knew it was moving, or maybe it was just disappearing. In the Eastern traditions, you know, they call that the law of impermanence. You know, that if we understand that everything is passing, then we have wisdom, they would say. And if we don't know that, then we are ignorant, you know, because it's all passing. So that does change my relationship to things. And maybe I don't have to orchestrate everything or control everything or glom onto it and make it, you know, freeze for me or stop for me, you know. So, you know, I think, yeah, that's fundamental to it, is detachment. And then the point of the prayer is not to be there all the time or to feel that in any particular way all the time, because that would be a certain kind of attachment too. Like I want to feel like this by the end of my prayer, or by the end of 2 years, or the end of 20 years, you know, I want this to happen, this outcome. It doesn't really have goals in that way. You know, it has intention. And really, the prayer is about having that show up in our daily life. I think somebody put that in the chat box about fruits of centering prayer. Centering prayer, the fruits show up in our day-to-day. We don't care if we feel good during the sit, or we don't feel good, or it's all bright and light, or it's dark and or whatever, you know. It's great when it is like that for me, and that encourages me to come back the next day, you know, but it doesn't always happen that way. And Keating said once in response to a question about, you know, someone saying, well, it's really great, it's insightful, I feel relaxed and I feel so close to God. And he says, that's terrific, but get ready, because next time it's liable to be what he called a toughie, you know, because it's also, if we're doing kind of spiritual and mental reconstruction, which is what we really think of in terms of transformation, then that's not always that easy to knock down a couple of walls, you know. It gets pretty dusty and messy. And I feel that sometimes. I'm like, no, I don't want to let go of that. But I appreciate you bringing that up, Emily, that, you know, yeah, just that idea that it's a process of detachment.
Yes, thank you
Thank
for
you.
that question,
Yeah.
Emily. And another question from the chat, Mark, was, if we feel like we are hearing from God, why should we go back to our symbol?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because that's a value judgment, right? We're freezing the process. And again, this is just for the time that we're formally in the practice. There may be other times where you're really actively cultivating this kind of conversation with God. That's what a lot of our word prayers are about, or having, you know, petitions and things like that. But in the practice, the reason why is because we would be stopping the prayer as it's presented, you know, the prayer of consent, the prayer of letting go. Because then we're saying, okay, wait, let me figure this out. What's going on here? Let me talk back to God about this. Let's you know, see what's happening. And that's important at certain times, just not during that time of the prayer. And that seems like a fairly rigid and really kind of harsh part of the teaching. And maybe it is. And it takes that kind of discipline in us to not have that exception, to say, well, wait a minute, let me start thinking now, because this seems really good or juicy. Yeah,
Thank you for that. Thanks very much. Another good question. I thought for me, it was a good question. I can't seem to keep doing this faithfully for more than a short period of time. Any suggestions?
Yeah, just as best you can, just come back again. You know, the beauty of it is you can enter in at any time. You could have started this 5 years ago and then stopped, and you can just come back to it now, like right now. You just started again when you were in this workshop. But it is hard at times, and to find time for it, to make time for it, and also just to sit still. And sometimes I can come up with 1,000 excuses why it's not a good time to do it. The thing that changed it for me, because I went back and forth for a long time, and a lot of it, I sort of filtered it through this idea of like the best time to do it, you know? So I was like, well, I'll try now. And my kids were young at the time, very young. And so, you know, they were getting up like the crack of dawn. And I thought, you know, I can't practice now. They're up and they're screaming and yelling, you know. So I tried to get up before them. And it seemed like they knew I was awake in the house, you know, and they get up earlier, you know. And the thing that changed it for me, and it sounds a little weird, is when they got to, they were in a preschool. It was a Montessori school. And there just happened to be a large cemetery right down the street from the school. And I was the one dropping them off every morning. So it just dawned on me, you know what, I won't fuss with trying to get it done before they wake up. Take them to school, and then I'll go. And I went to this cemetery. I had a friend who was buried there. I went pulled next to his grave, and just got out and I prayed. And suddenly my practice got very consistent every day. And then on the weekends, I just found other time, and you know. So it's good to pick a consistent time, because then you start to not have other things scheduled for that time, whatever that is, first thing in the morning, last thing at night, lunchtime. And then to have kind of a structure that way, a place, if you can afford to have a certain space in your home to do it, you know, that helps too, because you can just sit down and you're already saying, okay, this is what I'm doing here, you know. So time and place, and not that you have to have all kinds of cushions and burn incense and create a whole thing like that, but it can help to have a little structure for that. And if you don't, and you miss it for a day or a year, then just when you wake up to it again, just come back and start practicing there. God's not keeping score, as far as I understand.
Thank you very much for that also, Mark. We really appreciate that. And we're coming up to a hard stop. And so I just want to again say a really, really big thank you to Mark for being here, and especially for your graciousness and staying this extra time and taking the extra questions. Clearly that's been helpful for folks. And then thank you again to Adam and Caitlin. Couldn't have done this without you, obviously. Thank you so much. And just everyone who was here, we really appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you all. It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Phil.